So I'm here to talk about building compassionate communities in tech. A lot of times speakers at conferences give you a little bio, like a rundown of their resume, so you know if you should pay attention to this person. And I kind of like offended a few people by complaining about that on Twitter, because I think it's kind of tedious. But some people pointed out that a bio can be kind of nice, and I think they made a pretty good point. So I'm going to tell you why I'm the last person in the world that should be giving advice about community or social interactions or anything like that. So let's go back about 30 years. This is me, super nerdy kid. This is like the least nerdy picture of me I could find from that time. I was really into dinosaurs. Most kids like dinosaurs, but I memorized all their names and which ones descended from which other ones, and I wasn't really interested in playing with dinosaur toys with other kids. If anybody interrupted me reading books about dinosaurs, they'd get a lecture about dinosaurs, and that lecture would keep going as they went away. Eventually I got bored with dinosaurs because they're all dead, and they're also like these weird reptile birds, and I couldn't really relate with them. So I dropped that like a bad habit, and I decided to learn about something that's closer to me, and I figured I'm a mammal, and I lived in North America, so I'd learn all the North American mammals. And this is before you could just go to Wikipedia and read the list, right? So I was reading all these books and learning about them, and I became this Wikipedia page. That got me really into studying evolution, memorizing the lines to movies and songs, taking electronics apart and kind of swapping their parts around. I got really into different kinds of knots and their histories when I was a kid, and I freaked out my 5th grade teacher by tying a perfect noose and explaining to her as if she would of course be very interested in this, that they used to use this kind of knot to kill people. And the world was a pretty interesting place for a really nerdy kid like that, but it was also kind of lonely, and I didn't really have a lot of friends. So I didn't really understand why people were so incomprehensible, and they really seemed to get along well with each other, but I just always made them go away because they weren't interested in all these really fascinating things. And so I was kind of a bit angsty as a result, I guess. And then I got into computers. And computers are great. There's all these other nerds, and they're just as interested in all this super nerdy stuff as I am. And in college, I learned a lot about computers, and there were all these basically infinite set of details and complicated things to really dig into and learn about. And people were friends with me because I knew stuff, and when you're in college, being that intense nerdy guy is kind of a certain sort of status, right? There's a spot for that guy in a college social circle. So I still kind of felt like an outsider, but I found a place where those outsiders belonged. When I moved to California and started working in software, I had a pretty serious reality check. It turns out that this mythology of really brilliant reclusive geniuses is false. Most technology is always developed by teams of people. And since I wasn't living in a dorm anymore, there wasn't this free access to social circles. So surrounding myself with other nerds actually made the problem a lot worse. And I was kind of alone all over again. So the solution at that time was obvious: just make building a community a thing to nerd out on. So this really isn't something I'm born knowing, and it's not something that I have a talent for. None of it really comes naturally to me. In fact, I'm probably worse at this stuff than most other people. But I have actually done a lot of work on trying to get better, and so I'm going to share some of the tools and resources that I found in the hopes that it can be helpful for other people. And I'm also going to give you some homeworks that you can eventually get good at this stuff. At the most basic level, a community is a group of people who have something in common, right? You can talk about the elderly community in a particular city or something. But the real difference between what we usually mean when we say community and just some random group of people is that a community is a group of people who interact with one another because of what they have in common. Communities are groups of people that communicate and interact, right? And because we're such social animals, we do a ton of this stuff. And we form opinions about the community as a thing in itself based on the quality of our interactions within that community. So this can actually also be, not just the tech community, but the JavaScript community or a particular company or a team or whatever. In anthropology and in sociology, interactions are sometimes broken down based on positive or negative interactions. It's not a normative judgment. It's not one's better and one's worse. In nature, predation is actually really important, and even in human activities, sometimes in sports, you have a certain amount of conflict. If you're friends with somebody, you might kind of tease each other, and that's safe and fun and good. But that being said, most people vastly overestimate the value of negativity and the value of conflict, especially once it's already started. Part of this is purely biological. One negative interaction with somebody, even like the perception of negativity, like they step in front of you in line at the grocery or something, it starts this chain of instinctive reactions that causes adrenaline to go through our system, and it sends blood away from the brain and towards the arms and the legs, and like we get ready for a fight. And all of our introspection and all of our strategic thinking goes right out the window because there is no place for any of that bullshit when you're in a fight. Like, that's not evolutionarily advantageous, right? So once we've committed, and another thing is once we've committed to a specific course of action, we'll do almost anything in our power to rationalize why that course of action was a good idea. But in business and software, just in life, even when a negative interaction was, justified, it's still a net loss if a positive interaction was possible. So once we're in that conflict spiral, though, our brains make everything about the conflict. So every interaction is colored by that. We can't stop thinking about it. It keeps us up at night. Our brains just work not as well. Even recognizing that there's a cycle going on is really tricky. And once we acknowledge that it's happening, getting off of this like adrenaline dopamine roller coaster is also incredibly challenging. So we can pour massive amounts of time and energy and attention into even relatively trivial conflicts. And I'm sure that every single one of us in this room have done this. So what we should really do, I think, is approach conflicts more intelligently so that we can minimize drama and come out of high-intensity interactions in such a way that it has a net positive effect on our community. And if our goal is to create the kind of community that we ourselves want to interact with and have fun with, and that we can get the most value out of it, then we ought to figure out how we can have more positive interactions in that community. So for me, when I see our tech communities being dominated by negative communication, by like very, defensive and kind of violent communication, I feel kind of scared and frustrated, actually, because I'm sort of scared for our communities because I really need them to thrive. My livelihood sort of depends on this, and as does all the rest of ours. And also it's kind of frustrating because I know these people are so smart, and I really want all these smart people to notice the unproductive cycle that they're in and the time that they're wasting. So my request to you is to help with this goal, and that's what this talk is really about. So you can't actually, despite what it says on the first slide, you can't actually just build a compassionate community like you would build a treehouse, right? You have to kind of become it, and we have to all become it together. So there's two parts to this. First, we really need to set up and try to set up situations, guidelines, cultural mores so that newcomers are encouraged kind of in the direction of positivity, and such that interactions between strangers tend towards positive interactions, even if those people weren't already friends from the get-go. And second, we need to equip ourselves and one another with the tools to turn negative interactions into positive interactions as early in the process as possible. Because like I said, it's pretty much very difficult to do once you're already kind of caught in that loop. So it sounds kind of simple, and it's maybe even sort of obvious, but this second task is so much more challenging than it sounds. This talk won't make you good at this stuff. I'm still a novice, and I think really the intent here is just to get over some of the biggest hurdles to learning and improving social interaction techniques. It's not important. I'm fine already. I don't need to change anything. All three of these basically boil down to a very common attitude among technology people, which is that social interactions, all this stuff, is somebody else's job. And I don't know if it's just that programming tends to attract a lot of very shy introverts, or if our cultural stereotype is of this like rude, socially inept programmer made us all think this was okay, but it's really very short-sighted. And that rude programmer stereotype is actually a problem. If we want positive communities, it's up to us to create them, to become them, and it's really a practice that happens over time. So each of us, in every interaction we have, we can probably guide more towards good, but not unless we have the skills and we work to build those skills to do so. So even if you learn this and read the books I tell you to read and take it all really super seriously, you'll probably end up noticing that you're a lot worse at conflict than you originally thought, because most people are terrible at this. And it's really on all of us to go out and practice these kinds of interactions we want to see. So the reason why this is so important is that our job is a social activity. So just as you wouldn't expect somebody to be born knowing C or JavaScript, expecting everybody to just know how to interact with one another is actually kind of complicated. It's kind of ridiculous. As a profession, we've gotten over the notion that it's okay for programs to be difficult to read. Once upon a time, that was like, no big deal, you just make it go faster. We've moved as a craft towards writing human understandable programs as an acknowledgement that we spend more of our time reading and debugging programs than we spend initially writing them. And so I think it's time we get over this notion that programmers can get away with being jerks and start recognizing social interaction as a core programmer competency, right? As an acknowledgement of the fact that software is created in communities rather than in a vacuum. So being bad at this stuff means that you're being bad at developing software. And so that's enough preamble. Let's talk about some tools that you can actually use to do some of this stuff, to get better at helping to build communities that are more compassionate and more geared towards mutual success. So first, if you take nothing else away from this talk, if you forget everything else I said, that's fine. Just please go get this book. It's called Nonviolent Communication by Marshall B. Rosenberg. Like I said, I'm not an expert in this stuff, and this talk is not a substitute for reading his book. And reading his book is not a substitute for actually diligently building a practice of doing what he suggests. But I'll give a brief overview of some of the points it covers and some of the ways that it's changed my personal approach to open source communities. So the primary goal of NVC is to get us to focus our attention on 4 primary components when we're communicating. The first is specific, demonstrable, objective observations about the world, our feelings and our emotional responses to those observations, our personal needs and desires and wishes that sort of cause those feelings, that give rise to them, and specific, actionable physical requests that we make of other people. So this is like the basic format of an NVC message in the NVC protocol, if you think of it that way. You state a clear objective observation, you say the emotional reaction you have when you observe it, you take ownership of that feeling by expressing the personal needs and desires, and you end on an actionable request. When I see colleagues communicating this way, I feel extremely proud and happy because I really want our communities to function and run very smoothly and be as efficient. So please learn this technique and use it. But just matching the pattern is not enough, right? If you just fill in all those details with the same language of judgment and indirection, it doesn't, you're actually making things worse, right? So the hard part of this is not the protocol. That's like a tease. That's just a little something that's easy enough and simple and stupid enough for you to actually remember when you lose all your IQ points. It's really about focusing your attention so that we can do 2 things. So the first is to communicate in such a way that we honestly express our own feelings, observations, needs, and requests. And the second is to receive the message of others in terms of their observations, feelings, needs, and requests, even if they're not doing it themselves. So the goal isn't to get other people to be nice to you. The goal is to figure out what they need that isn't being met when they're not being nice to you, when they're being a jerk. There's no immediate prize. It's all about the long-term benefit. This is basically like Postel's law applied to humans. The reason it works as well as it does is because it teaches us to be strict in what we send, but extremely liberal in what we receive. So even if somebody, we radically change our focus and we limit the messages that we send, but we also limit the messages that we allow ourselves to respond to. In other words, don't bother trying to tone police other people. Keep your own messages very well structured, but use whatever information they give you to try and figure out their own observations, feelings, needs, and requests. So whatever venom they're spitting, right, they're giving you clues. Use those clues, pull out what they need that's not being met, and then demonstrate that you understand it. This is super black belt level troll husbandry. I've seen people come in extremely angry on mailing lists and on GitHub, and without any exception, so far in my experience, responding in kind only makes things worse. But when I show them that I actually understand what they're feeling and what they're needing and what they're not getting, it turns a really passionate enemy into a very passionate ally, right? And so as Rosenberg writes, when we're communicating violently, our attention is focused on classifying, analyzing, and determining levels of wrongness rather than on what we and others need and are not getting. And classifying and judging people promotes violence. It adds to the drama, it adds to the conflict. Some things that are very common in our communication, so common you probably don't even notice them, but which are conspicuously absent from NVC, are all these things. They're not necessarily all bad in themselves. I mean, you do have to judge somebody if you're going to be hiring them for a job or something, but these are communication anti-patterns. They tend to escalate conflicts rather than guide them towards some kind of compassionate resolution. We tend to communicate violently because we're afraid, we feel threatened, we want to close ourselves off from some perceived vulnerability. We don't want anyone to see what we're actually feeling because genuineness makes things real, and that is really scary. But here's a secret. Genuine vulnerability doesn't make you less powerful. In fact, it makes you so much more powerful, and if you can summon the courage to really get in touch with that and be open about that, it has the power to really radically change interactions and relationships. So one thing that that comes up in my own mind about NVC a lot is this idea of the fundamental attribution error, which basically means that you attribute things to the fundamental character of an agent rather than attributing them to as a reasonable response to the nature of the situation. So it can take a lot of forms, but this is the most common one, right? I do things because of reasons. You guys do things because you're all big dumb idiots. And my hacky workarounds were unfortunately necessary. Your hacky workarounds mean you're a bad programmer. And I mean, this goes on and on. It's incredibly common. Once you kind of learn to see this pattern, you start to notice it all over the place. But the nonviolent, non-judgmental way to look at this is I do things because of my observations, thoughts, feelings, and needs. So does everybody else. It's a really hard part of having these tools at the ready when they're needed. But seriously, get this book. If you have your laptop out right now, like go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble or whatever, download it, have it sent to your Kindle, whatever you use, your iPad, whatever, read it on the plane on the ride home. It takes a couple hours to read, but it takes really a lifetime to master and put into practice. So the hard thing is, like I said, having it at the ready, because it is a sad rule that whatever we most need our skills, when our art is most critically important, that's when we're most likely to forget how to handle ourselves properly. So let's talk a little bit dig a little bit more into strategy and tactics. NVC does have some tactical advice, but I think the biggest advantage is, like I said, the focus, kind of the strategic approach. But even if you use it kind of clumsily, it's still usually better than any alternative. But you still need to build the strength of reachings for those. And one book that's specifically on navigating conflict that I found very useful is called Crucial Conversations by Patterson, Grenny, McWillan, and Switzler. It doesn't directly mention NVC, mostly for copyright reasons, but it builds on a lot of the same principles. And it talks specifically about situations when there are directly opposing opinions, overwhelming emotions, and very high stakes. I'm not going to go into as much detail about this one, but they do focus on one aspect of communication, which is very important for communities as well, and that's safety. When we feel safe, it's a lot easier to be vulnerable, to get to the heart of any issue, of what's actually going on. When somebody doesn't feel safe communicating at all, then no amount of compassion will get them to open up. Safety is the exact opposite of conflict. It means that we expect that our vulnerability will be well received. We feel it's easy to be honest and genuine. Think about how you feel like hanging out with a really good friend. Crucial Conversations has some very specific tactics for how to notice that people are losing that safe feeling and how to get them back towards it. The two main things are building mutual purpose and mutual respect. The mutual respect part basically boils down to communicating compassionately and being quick to recognize when we fuck that up, because you will a lot. Mutual purpose is really nice, and I think it's something that really gets into the nitty-gritty of dealing with potentially dangerous situations. Because there's a lot of situations where there are multiple parties and their needs seem to be in direct opposition to one another. So this is very useful if you run any open source project or have to manage people in a team, or even if you just know anyone that you ever interact with in your life ever. One canonical example of losing sense of that mutual purpose that we see in tech communities a lot is trolling. And what I'm going to suggest is not the only strategy to handle trolling that I've ever seen, or the only one that probably works, but it's one that I found to be extremely powerful and really be useful in Node. And since I've rambled about NVC for a long time, you can probably guess what I'm going to suggest you do first, which is to start out with compassion. Most people who violate social norms in our community forums, they honestly don't want to cause any harm. They might not speak English fluently or whatever the language is in that area. They might be a 16-year-old kid who's trying to impress a bunch of grown-ups with jokes that they think are really funny. They might just be drunk. I don't know. But most of the time, the point is they're not evil, they're just clumsy. And even so, even if they say something that's really super offensive, responding with violent communication will only escalate a relatively minor problem into a big, serious conflict and a blowout. So the policy in the Node IRC channel, it's not perfect, but it does work pretty well. Big thanks to all of to Nexi and Max and all the other channel mods who help out with this, but basically, there's no public shaming. If we have to tell somebody that they're misbehaving, that's done in private. Embarrassment tends to make somebody much more defensive. It's magnified about 100 times when you are criticizing them in public, right? Now they really like dig their heels in, and they're like, no, like I have to put up a fight. This person's like bothering me. But it's a lot easier when something's in private and it's a little bit more safe. It's a lot easier to be vulnerable and to be a good teacher and for them to accept that help. And while being compassionate is important, it's also important to impress upon them that this is not a negotiation. Like, I'm here to help you succeed at following the rules, but the rules, we're not like discussing what the rules are right now. No. 95% or so of the cases that I've seen, this is as far as it goes, problem solved. People behave really differently when they're in private, when it's clear that they're safe, that they have nothing to gain by being defensive. So that's the first line. The second line of defense is the kick ban. Do not negotiate with terrorists. Social norms might, like I said, it's not a negotiation, right? Social norms may be created democratically by a community, but it's important to remember that the community sets its own mores and its own rules. People who disrespect those rules don't belong in that community. They're not a part of it. Freedom of speech gives them the right to go set up their own IRC channel somewhere else, where they get to make the rules. But it doesn't give anybody the right to disrespect the rules of a community and expect to remain welcome there. Of course, this only works if you're the admin or one of them. If you don't have ops in whatever channel that is, I still recommend acting as if these are the rules, even in their parallels in real life. Talk to the admins, let them know what happened, how it went. If you're handling it the way that they would like you to handle it, never, never, never spit venom back in public or try to publicly shame somebody. That can really only make things worse. It's extremely counterintuitive, but if you take somebody and make an example of them, right? The example you actually make is that this type of behavior is normal, and that this is a place where we have fights. It's exactly the opposite of a way to create a positive, compassionate community. If the admins won't help you for whatever reason, and you have no choice, like, in my opinion, the best course of action usually is just to leave. It's not your responsibility to fix every community out there, and there's a lot out there. And maybe these are communities like Hacker News or 4chan where people just like to fight. And now, like, you're the outsider coming in trying to boss everybody around. Better just to move on, find or create something better. Sometimes, however, leaving is not an option. It might be the town where you live. It might be a company that you're heavily invested in, that you're trying to affect some change in, or something that you really, really care about. So in that case, if leaving's not an option and you're not already in charge, I recommend taking over. Just like seize the reins of power, right? So this might be a lot less difficult than it seems in some cases. A lot of people who are running communities or running groups really just need help. They might want to do things this way, but they just don't have the head count to really, diligently enforce these rules. Whatever you do, try to lead by example. Be the one that people can point to and say, like, this is how it should be done. It takes a tremendous amount of willpower to actually do this, and even if you do succeed, you'll find that there's a lot more people shitting on you than there are. They'll have a lot more people shitting on you than you get attention for cleaning up their shit. The rewards are worth it, but I don't know how you could actually do it if you didn't really love what you were doing. And last, if it gets serious, get serious. Like, don't go to battle with /B on their turf. If you wrestle with a pig, you both get dirty, and the pig likes it. So, I didn't make up that joke. That's old. If people email you like horrible things like death threats and whatnot, like, get the law involved right away. Get a lawyer. Call the cops. Like, track down who's doing this. If the second things go from the online space to real space and your physical security is actually being threatened, that usually indicates that, probably you should have left that community already because it's maybe not salvageable. But also it's completely dysfunctional and violent at that point. I certainly don't want to dismiss what a big problem that is when it happens, but like statistically speaking, it is an edge case. And it's something that we should optimize for avoiding rather than, spend all of our time and energy talking about how we're gonna, put people in jail or whatever. The defining characteristic of most tech communities is that they're not in meat space, so things work a little bit differently. So this is the last book I'm going to recommend, but it's very focused on this aspect of online communities. It's called Producing Open Source Software by Carl Fogle, and this recounts some of the takeaways from the Subversion project. So obviously this was the days before GitHub, and some of the specific details are a little bit dated, but even as our tools change, humans stay more or less the same. So the stuff that Fogle describes is very appropriate. In online communities, you are what you write, and what you write sticks around much longer than the feeling you had when you wrote it. What this means is every time you interact with anyone online, we're creating our identity. And what's worse, we're creating an identity that'll be a part of a lasting legacy. And when a newcomer arrives at your mailing list or your Git repo or your Twitter feed, whatever, for the first time, what they see is the sum total of their understanding of you as a person. Even if it's something you wrote years ago, when you hadn't slept and you were hungry, and that's going to shape their view of the community. So if we want to encourage new interactions to be positive, like I said, we have to make our current interactions positive so that it sets a tone, and that shapes who is attracted to our community, the attitude that they kind of carry when they're in it, and if people are mean, then the newcomers are going to be defensive, and you'll scare away the people who don't feel like being mean. So any social mores we institute or we create end up being self-propagating, no matter what. Also, time is a non-renewable resource. So it's real easy for well-meaning newcomers to waste a lot of your time. So documentation is critically important. We don't do this all that well in Node. Our API is great, but a lot of other things are not so great. It's a tremendous task to keep all this stuff up to date, but it's the reason why beginner docs are so important, why onboarding docs are actually more important than the more advanced stuff. Because once somebody kind of gets over that hurdle, they start knowing where to go to dig in stuff. They start pulling their weight. But that's actually why I flat out refuse to answer most IRC questions in private. If a new user has a question, you might think it's nice to just help them out, and sometimes it is, but help out by pointing them at the documentation, and if that doc doesn't exist, then go write it and then point them at it. So if they email you directly, just ask them to kind of take it to the mailing list, or if they ping you an IRC, ask them to take it to the public channel. Usually they're not trying to waste your time, right? I've had this conversation a lot. I'll get some private message on IRC from somebody who's trying to do something. They're like, oh, that's Isaacs, he's the NPM guy, I'll just ping him. And years ago, I used to try to answer these questions when it first started happening, but that takes a lot of time, and it's really repetitive, it's kind of unpleasant. So I'd start to get resentful of how much time it was taking, and or I might not be around, and they'd sit there waiting forever, and then they'd be kind of annoyed that I never got back to them. And so I started to kind of snap at people sometimes, and over time I realized they weren't pinging me to be annoying, so I tried to be a little bit more like MVC-ish about my request. So this is like a nice little thing I can just copy and paste from a text file into IRC. And the result is pretty much always the same. Turns out they weren't trying to be disrespectful. My frustration was actually the problem. They were trying to not bug all the other people. They were trying to follow the rules as they happened to understand them. They just didn't know. So drama is, like I said, drama always overflows its container. Whatever type of box you try to create around the conflict, it will grow out of that, no matter where you try to put it. So the only way to counter this fact is to just, as early and as quickly as possible, get things going in as positive a direction as you can. When we turn these, even really trivial conflicts into positive interactions, it ends up building up positivity in our community bit by bit. I really like this metaphor, putting pennies in the trust bank or in the bonding bank, and I think it's really relevant. It's a good metaphor for a lot of reasons. First of all, it takes an enormous amount of time to actually build up that bond of trust between people, and it takes very, very little time to spend it. Every positive interaction is just another tiny little penny added to your credibility, added to the community's valence. So quality does matter, but quantity matters a lot. It takes a lot of time. Second of all, I don't know if this is the case in Ireland or the UK or EU, but in the US where I'm from, a penny is actually worth a lot more as raw materials than it is as legal tender. And applied to this case, you find that a lot of the time, these trust deposits, these little positive interactions, they're not just tiny. They actually might even feel kind of wasteful. I'm spending so much time doing all these things, I don't see any benefits. The ROI is actually really hard to see. But over time, these pennies kind of add up and eventually start to pay interest. So you can't get much benefit from a community or engage with the community as in marketing speak in any sort of way without actually being a part of that community. Credibility is the result of repeated, consistent good behavior. you really just can't do that all at once. You can't come in and be like, haha, I am part of this community now, trust me. Like, it doesn't work that way. It takes a lot of time, and it can be spent shockingly quickly. So I'm almost out of time, but as I mentioned, I do have some homework for you. Get this book. Oh my God, I'm not kidding. It might not be the kind of thing you're used to reading. If you're used to reading like more like technical type stuff or whatever, yeah, you need to do this, even if you don't think you do. Even great communicators can get better at this. This gives you superpowers. You think I'm exaggerating about the superpowers. I'm not exaggerating about the superpowers. You need this. The second one is to actually practice these techniques. So you don't have to be perfect, but you won't get any closer to perfect unless you practice by getting better. So just the most important thing is to learn to notice when you slip up. And I mean, don't beat yourself up, but try to like replay in your head how it could have gone better, and you know, how things could have gone in a better direction. And you know, also don't accept that it's anybody else's responsibility to make our communities good than our own. So it really helps, I found, to find a buddy who's willing to work, who's also working on consciously improving their skills, and try to agree to help each other do better, like give each other permission to be kind of critical. You know, we do code reviews, right? Like, we all do code reviews, and humans are so much more complicated than JavaScript. I don't know why we don't get in the habit of doing communication reviews, you know, or interaction reviews. So, you know, if there's somebody you can kind of sit down with and be like, oh, like, look at this email discussion, I'm not sure I handled this well, like, what do you think? And, you know, get some advice or get an outside opinion. That really, really helps a lot. So finally, go out and have fun. This is, it's pretty much impossible to be like compassionate with each other when we aren't happy and satisfied with ourselves. So, you know, brains work best when they're not under stress, when they're not in a conflict state. So there's a lot to learn and master and practice, and it's a lot like programming, actually. But when you write a program, you know right away if it worked or not. With this, it's kind of this slow process of constant improvement, and the rewards are a lot less immediate. Mastery takes a really long time. It can take a lifetime. So it's really important to find a way to have fun with this stuff and kind of see it as a craft that you're going to like continually improve at. And I think if you can feel good about your improvement and seek out new challenges, then you can find the motivation to really stick with it and keep working at it, keep working on getting better. So my slides are on the internet at this URL. I'm Isaacs, IZS, I@izs.me. Thank you very much.